Welcome to Keto Life Support, where we make your keto life sustainable, fun, and low stress. I'm Kim Howerton, and I'll be coming to you weekly with some of my keto besties to bring you the practical, real-world keto advice that you need. Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and even if we do have a doctor in the house from time to time, he or she is not your doctor, and nothing we say on this show should be taken as medical advice. Always check in with a trusted medical professional about your own personal medical concerns.
Hello, this is Kim Howerton with Keto Life Support. This is episode 93. And today we're going to talk about dirty keto. Okay, what do I mean? So I got this comment this week on my live on YouTube. I will read it to you. I will not identify the person. I'm wondering, keto people promoting eating whole foods, and you are eating bread made only from processed powders. How can this be healthy? Emphasis mine. So what happened was I made the original title is the protein sparing modified fast bread. So it's a bread made from this one was made from dried egg whites and a few other ingredients. The primary ingredient is egg whites. So the original recipe invented by Maria Emmerich was with egg whites, so fresh egg whites. Then I guess she figured out you could actually make the bread with dried egg whites. And it was easier than cracking 12 eggs and throwing away a bunch of yolks, right? So it made sense. And dried egg whites pretty much are just egg whites that have been dried. So all she does is add the water back to the dried egg whites. You put them together, you get egg whites. So this comment made me kind of chuckle a little bit, but I thought, it kind of opens up a good thing to look at in terms of how much does the fresh whole foods versus ingredients, how much do those ingredients really matter? And it's really a nuanced discussion. So to answer this person, well, you'll have to listen to the podcast. We'll get there. All right. So first off, I'd like to say no, that's defensive. I'm not defensive. People, I'm not. I'm going to get into it. Okay. So in this world of keto, you know that there's a big push of just eat whole, real foods. There's even, JERF, just eat real food. I guess a W doesn't make sense in there. So it's this idea that if you know what that food is, you can see that it's a slab of muscle meat. You can see that it's a piece of broccoli. You can see what it is, what it was. It's fine. Eat it. It's a whole food. And then it gets a little murky, right? There's this idea around processed foods being bad. And it's a little bit of a challenge. It's like, you know what I mean, is like what you have to say with all these things, right? Because we'll say, well, processed foods, generally speaking, are not as nutritious. They're easier to overeat. And by the way, this applies to not just keto, like across the board with foods for any diet, right? Even a vegan, right? A processed food vegan versus a whole foods vegan. They exist, right? It's different. But the term that I try to use is actually highly processed foods to try and differentiate it, because the reality is processed just means that you've done something to it. So if you cook a steak, you've processed the food. If you blend something, you've processed it. If you mix two things together, right? So you have to think, okay, well, maybe the processing isn't the bad thing in and of itself, because in fact, you could say that the processing of food is what allowed humans to become so intelligent, right? The timing of the growth of the human brain that allowed us to become what we are today. We went from a much less evolved organism to a more intelligent, bigger brained one that coincides with the invention of cooking. That we can get a lot more nutrients from foods that we cook, and therefore it allowed us to become more nourished. So actually processing foods in and of itself is not the issue so much as how processed they are and how they are processed, if that makes sense. For example, if you take a slab of beef and you cook it, you process it to a certain degree. it's then edible and good and all that. If you chop that steak up, if you mince it into what in America we call hamburger and in UK they call mince, right? That ground meat, it's actually more bioavailable. They've done a study where they looked at elderly people who have trouble absorbing protein as much, or it's an issue with their ability to absorb as much and their anabolic threshold and that kind of thing. And so they found that this population that had this issue, if you gave them ground meat as opposed to whole meat, they actually got more out of it because it was partially processed. So you can see from this example that in some instances, additional processing can be useful for us to get better nutrition. However, when we talk about highly processed foods, or what some people just call processed foods, that's not exactly what they're talking about. And I think anyone who's ever been to a grocery store and walked the chip aisle kind of knows what I mean. So in these places where people make highly processed foods that are hyper palatable, that means you really, really want to eat them and they're not as filling. You put all these things together and you've got, pardon my language, but just a shitstorm, right? And it's very difficult to navigate. So there is a gradation of processing. And to this comment I got about keto people are people who only eat whole real foods and this is processed bread you're talking about. First, I want to say I was making somebody else's recipe. Defensive again. Anyway, but I'd like to say that is a form of what I think of as extremism a bit. So when I first started keto, I was pretty extremist. I had a list of don't eat this ingredient, don't eat that ingredient, don't eat this, you can't have that, look at the label, does it have this in it? And that can be very helpful for people who never learned how to analyze what's good for them, never learned how to listen to their body to know what was good or bad. And I think absolutely, completely agree with the world who says our diet should primarily be real whole foods and not highly processed foods. I think that is exactly true. I think we are healthier that way. We have better satiety that way. We have better access to nutrients that way. It can be a way to end up just naturally choosing a much healthier diet and having much better health outcomes. But let's talk about occasionally including some ingredients that go beyond those bounds. Let's talk, for example, about this egg white bread. So I made Indigo Neely's version of the protein sparing modified fast bread that Maria Emmerich created. So the original version, basically, well, this version in the original form, we're on like version 27.32. You put dried egg whites. And again, so let's talk about the difference between different processed foods, right? In this instance, we dried, well, I didn't, but the company that made them, Keto Chow made the ones I used. They're very good. Dried egg whites. And to do that, you literally are drying egg whites. There's not a giant chemical industrial process involved in bleach and this and that. It's drying. We all dry food, right? When you cook something in the oven, you're letting some of that moisture evaporate out. It's partially drying it. So we're drying the egg whites and then adding water back to them to reconstitute them. So now we have egg whites. And then in this recipe, there's some allulose, which you could argue is definitely a very processed food. Allulose, erythritol, any of the sweeteners, you got to do a lot of magic to make those things into sugars, right? However, they're pretty well studied. What is the actual effect? We can get into that, certainly, that ingredient, but how much of that did I put in? I put in about 2 tablespoons of that. So in the whole loaf of bread, it was a pretty small proportion. But you could argue totally at that point, well, I don't eat that. Okay, don't eat that bread then. If you don't want that ingredient, don't eat it. Then there was in this recipe some butter powder. And I don't know what magic happens to make butter powder, to be perfectly honest. It is very strange, but it was good. And its ingredients were just butter. I don't know how that works, but they did it. And then this particular ingredient, and this is where some of you are going to raise your eyebrows, had a little bit of arrowroot flour in it. Arrowroot flour, those of you who spent any time paleo might have heard of it. It is a paleo flour. Now, it's very high carb. There are some keto gurus out there who make bread with a lot of arrowroot powder, and that one raises both my eyebrows because that's like, I mean, central to being low carb is the low carbs, that they are low. But this is where it gets a little murky because, again, this recipe only had 2 tablespoons of this arrowroot powder. So when I sliced up my loaf, each slice from the arrowroot powder had less than a half a gram of carbohydrate. So that is a pretty low amount of carbohydrates coming from this arrowroot flour. And arrowroot flour is unique from, say, wheat flour in that it has a much less allergenic effect for people that have any kind of gluten sensitivity. It's totally gluten-free. So there were absolutely some highly processed ingredients in this bread. And the reality is, do any of us really need to eat bread? No, I can survive, absolutely survive eating steak, very happily eating steak and vegetables for the rest of my life, and that would be good. But sometimes I would like some other things. I am a variety girl. I am a creative girl. I like all that kind of stuff mixed in. And so I do make choices to make certain recipes. Now, if you've been to a grocery store in recent years, you'll see that there are now a lot of very highly processed keto foods out there. There are things like keto Pop-Tarts. I have eaten a keto Pop-Tart. It was pretty tasty. And then I remembered I don't even really like regular Pop-Tarts because they taste like highly processed foods that are not really super high quality. And that was kind of the experience. So, but, tried them, didn't die. A side story, I ran into another keto person at the conference. Surprise, they're all keto people, but one I know. And she said, "Did you try those Pop-Tart things?" I was like, "Yeah, they were interesting and, kind of fun." And she's like, "Well, I bought a box, took them to my room last night, and I ate the whole box." And I was like, "Okay, well, you probably shouldn't buy those again," right? So that's the risk of highly processed foods more than other foods. Now, we can binge on anything if we want to, but the desire to binge is sometimes more overwhelming in the presence of some of these foods, and you should know that about yourself and know where you draw your boundaries. But I really want to be careful about the extremism that can come up in the keto world, or really any world, but in our community, in this community, in terms of not drawing such hard boundaries that we keep people out. So allowing some flexibility in what people do, not being the keto police. And trust me, I was once the keto police. I had a badge and everything. I think is an important thing. There's a phrase in another world, which is don't yuck someone's yum. Like if someone likes something, that's all right. And it's okay to educate, and it's okay to ask a question. So what I would suggest in situations like this to this person who made a comment, I'm making this so personal, aren't I? It's set as a question. It is a question. So it says, how can this be healthy? So let me actually answer that question instead of being on my high horse, right? If this is a real question, which I didn't take it as at first, and that might be my personal failing, how can this be healthy? So I looked at the ingredients that are in this bread. I looked at how much bread I might be having at any given time. And I said, hey, I think for me, this falls within the area I set my boundaries. It's comparatively speaking, very low carb. If I made a sandwich out of 2 slices of bread, if I count the allulose in that, I think I ended up with like a carb and a half for the 2 pieces of bread. It's primarily made of egg whites with a few other ingredients, none of which are horrendous. And I can then use it to make my life easier, have sandwiches, feel happy about the way that I eat. And so you weigh the trade-offs. What are the trade-offs here? Is there anything in this bread that I feel like is super potentially harmful for me? I thought about it. No, I feel pretty comfortable with these ingredients for me. Now, if somebody else was hypersensitive to arrowroot, I mean, it's such a small amount, but there might be somebody out there that's too much for. Okay, they probably shouldn't eat this version. They should leave that out. It's an optional ingredient. That's fine. Is there somebody who might say, it's so trust me, people, it's not exactly bread, right? But it's close to bread. It's like reminiscent of bread, but it's close enough to bread that I kind of I feel like I'm out of control when I eat it, and I won't stop eating until I eat the whole loaf. Okay, that's a person who needs to draw a boundary, but it's because it's triggering them in their binge eating issues. So that person, it would not be healthy for them to make this bread. But in terms of when you look at the ingredients involved in something, you have to evaluate them sort of individually and as a whole. What do I mean by that? So you pull something off the shelf and it's got an enormously long list of ingredients, including things that you really don't want to think you want to be eating or know that you want to be eating. Don't get it twisted. Some scientific names, if you read the ingredients of what is in, air and water and you don't know what hydrogen is, you'd be like, what is that? So, don't get confused that scientific names sound chemically, because they are. Everything's chemical. But if you're concerned about some ingredients, say there's like, this kind of starch and that kind of fiber and this kind of thing, you're like, it makes me nervous, then don't eat it. When in doubt, leave it out. And know that these foods with frosting and sprinkles and all that kind of stuff, even though they're made from sugar-free things, they're not very satiating. And your diet should be focused on satiating ingredients. That being said, if you have a type 1 diabetic child and you want to give them a very highly processed food Pop-Tart when they go to the sleepover, so they don't feel like they aren't part of the crowd when everyone's having breakfast, is that really the worst thing that could happen? No, there is a variety of products for a variety of occasions, depending on a variety of needs. And you don't have to eat anything you don't want to eat. But the question that might come up on how can this be healthy is you have to determine where you draw your lines. Where do you draw your lines about what you will and won't eat? And it's actually a fairly personal one. So let me go into how I make a decision. If I'm trying to stay super keto, the first thing I need to know is what is my carb limit? Because it's different for different people. If you don't know your carb limit and you're relatively new to keto, I would suggest 20 to 30 total grams of carbs per day. So now I know if I'm counting total carbs, they're going to keep me out of trouble with some ingredients because the carb count alone will make it a no. So now look, I've created one boundary. So first I look at the nutritional information. First, I would say, is the serving size reasonable? Because sometimes those serving size, they say it's a teaspoon, but you never eat a teaspoon. You eat like 2 tablespoons. So first, evaluate the serving size. Then look at the total carbs per serving size. Then look at, how is this fitting into the greater picture in terms of your nutrition overall? Look at the ingredient list at this point and say, is there anything in here that I'm concerned about eating that makes me uncomfortable, that I don't know about, that I don't want to eat? Let's say it's a package of pre-shredded cheese. Not Parmesan, because a really firm cheese doesn't need stuff added to it. But for cheddar, as an example, if you get the shredded one, you'll see that it says they've usually added, I found one the other day that didn't, but they've added either cellulose or potato starch or both. Now, a little tip with the cheeses, the sliced cheeses, they don't add this kind of stuff to. So if you're trying to stay completely out of the I don't know zone, get pre-sliced cheeses. And then if you're melting it, those melt great. Do them layered. So just a little tip, or you can chop them up a little bit if you don't want to have to grate a block of cheese. Now, grating a block of cheese isn't that hard, but just a little tip. Anyway, but if you say, I really want to buy the pre-shredded shreds of cheese, and you're looking at one and it's cellulose, and you're looking at another and it's potato starch, I would say I would aim for the cellulose one. What is cellulose? Well, literally cellulose is sort of akin to like wood fiber. I know, appetizing, but it's pretty much pure fiber, whereas the potato starch one, it's a starch, so you may get a little bit of carb from that potato starch. Now, in the grand scheme of things, how important is that little bit of starch? Probably not that important, but you can make educated decisions. I want the power in your hands to say, is this ingredient that big a deal to me? I always say the poison is in the dose, so how much is in there? And then evaluate, and then to determine if it's something you want to eat or not. But there's a good, better, best, right? So you can see that you can make choices along the way, what's good, what's better, what's best. then you're looking at something else. So you're first looking at like, does it fit within my carb allotment? First, that'll eliminate a ton of things. And you're like, no, I'm not going to eat it then. Okay, now you've set a boundary. Second, you're looking at those ingredients. Are there ingredients here that worry me? Is there another product that's similar that I can get the same experience from that doesn't have these ingredients that I'm worried about? Okay, great. Go for that. And then it's just less to worry about. Ultimately, at the end of the day, where you draw your boundaries are important. Certainly, eating a diet that is primarily based in a bunch of highly processed foods is good for no one. But if you choose to include some of them occasionally because for you they work, that's totally fine. And it's important to not, in my opinion, it's important to not draw your boundaries in such a way that is so highly limiting that you make yourself a little food prison. Your boundaries around food are supposed to bring you more food freedom. That is, freedom from feeling oppressed by your food and unsure of what you should and shouldn't be eating. So for me, my boundaries include making some recipes, using some protein powders in cooking, including some nut flours, including some sweeteners, ones that I feel comfortable for my body using. And the amazing thing about this world is we all get to choose where to draw our own boundaries. And that is awesome. And because I'm a coach and because I research these things, I will recommend to people certain recipes, products that I think are what I would call minimally impactful. And what I mean is a minimally negatively impactful, right? Because that allows you to have some flexibility and some joy in your eating. And if you're a person that doesn't work for, then don't eat those things. So in summary, I just want to say, yes, including some degree of carefully chosen, slightly processed foods can be included in your average keto diet and your average healthy diet of any form. But where you draw your boundaries is up to each individual person. I hope that was clear and helpful and not as defensive as I am now worried that I was, because that is who I am. All right, guys, you take care and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Keto Life Support. Want more information? Want show notes? Want to suggest a topic? Just head over to ketolifesupport.com. That's where all that kind of thing can go on. By the way, I have a request. If you could go to your podcast host and hit subscribe, we would really, really appreciate it. And what would be even more awesome is if you could write a review. And what would be even more awesome than that is if you could write like a really flattering review. Just asking, you do you. All right. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm thrilled that you're part of the Keto fam. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.